I'd like to welcome to the program Brian Concanon, Executive Director at Project Blueprint, Advisor to Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Brian, thank you for joining Emma and I. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you.
So we were just talking to Jemima Pierre, who is gave us a little bit of a background on the history of Haiti and the U.S. and also obviously France and whatnot. I want to talk about how Haiti. Let's just start with how Haiti fits in with the Biden foreign policy, and particularly like if we have a sense of, based upon what we've heard about the relationship between really the last 4 or 5 successive administrations and Haiti, if we're going to see any type of change with the Biden administration, at least from what we can tell 60 days in.
Sure. Well, first, anytime you're ever talking about U.S. policy in Haiti, you can never lose sight of the historical context that Professor Pierre just related. We like to think the past is past, but it is present. It informs, and especially the white supremacy aspects, informs U.S. policy to Haiti today and Haitians' reactions to it. I think there's kind of 3 things going on with the current U.S. policy to Haiti. One is that we're still in our own democratic transition. We have a confirmed Secretary of State, a confirmed UN ambassador. The third State Department official confirmed was just confirmed yesterday. So you don't have Biden's full team in place, and we're to some extent on Obama running on Trump legacy people. The second thing, I think, to the extent that the administration is paying attention to Haiti, they're mostly hoping that Haiti stays calm or stays low on the radar screen so they can get to other things. Haiti's not its top priority. But I think the third thing is that it is clear so far from what we know about Biden administration foreign policy, that its policy is much less progressive than its domestic policy is going to be, and will be to a decent extent a continuation of the policies of the Obama administration.
Well, I mean, I characterize that. I mean, is it basically we're going to try and control who essentially runs Haiti? I mean, is that essentially what for lack of any nuance, is that essentially what the Obama administration and I guess ultimately the Trump administration policy was, is that we're not terribly interested in democracy in Haiti because we want the ability to control who's going to be running that country?
You asked a great question with Professor Pierre about why the U.S. is doing it. And I think all of those things are true that you discussed earlier. And I would add that there is deep concern with Black people getting to vote who they want to vote for. To understand why that's problematic with respect to Haiti, we can look at Georgia. I mean, what happened when African Americans in Georgia voted in a decisive way? We have a huge response, which is trying to repress their votes as much as possible. Same thing happened in Milwaukee for the primaries. And I think that there really is a concern of allowing free democracy in Haiti, because there will be a challenge to much of the world's social order that keeps countries like Haiti poor and countries like the United States relatively wealthy. And the United States just did not want that kind of a challenge in 1804 when the world was run by slavocracies, and does not want that kind of a challenge in 2021 when the world is run by large corporations.
Tony Blinken spoke out early in Biden in Biden's term, really, even earlier than where we're at right now, and basically said that we are recognizing Guaido as the true leader of Venezuela, even though Guaido himself isn't necessarily seeking that in the same way he had been before. It's just bizarre to onlookers, but how does that portend for policy in Haiti then? Because you indicated it won't be as progressive as the domestic agenda. It seems to me that it's going to be fairly right-wing based on those early indicators.
Secretary Blinken gave a really interesting speech in late February to the UN Human Rights Council. And he said two really good things. First, he said, look, the US is back. We're engaging with international diplomacy, which was good. Second, he conceded that the US has a lot to do to keep its own human rights in order, especially with respect to economic injustice and racial discrimination. But then the third thing, when he started listing the problem countries in the world, he listed Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua as the first three places. And this was really going back, it was a flashback for me to college. It was the Reagan administration, and we're all of a sudden worrying about the Sandinistas being a 2 days drive away from Harlingen, Texas. It really is kind of a neo-Cold War mentality, not adapted to the reality on the ground in Haiti or anywhere else.
Well, I mean, that's what I was going to bring up. It's not just not adapted to the reality in these countries. It's also not adapted to the reality anywhere else. Ostensibly, right? I mean, because what is it? I mean, you said like there's a concern about what would happen if people in Haiti had the opportunity to vote in. Like, what does that concern look like? I mean, is there, because we don't have the sort of the excuse of, well, there's a domino effect, and if communism takes hold, and we don't put a check on it in Cuba, it's going to spread to Central America. Well, I mean, there is no big sort of like funding mechanism coming from the Soviet Union anymore to fund communist expansion. What we're afraid of now, those dominoes, what is it? Like, give me a sense of what it is that fear that we're afraid of is going to be the dominoes, because it's obviously not going to be communism that is exported from the Soviet Union. What is that fear? It's just going to be just the idea of maybe egalitarianism or what?
It's actually there. It is still the domino concern, but the concern never was with communism. The concern always was with popular democracy breaking out. I had a conversation back in the 90s when I asked a special forces guy who had been in the special forces in Haiti. He was an American military intelligence officer, and I asked him kind of the same question you did. Why is the U.S. investing so much in undermining democracy in Haiti? And he said, look, I was involved in the 80s in Central America and doing military intelligence. And when we were getting briefed as to what the biggest threat to U.S. interests were, we were told it was liberation theology. It wasn't Marxism. It was priests going around saying that the rich should share with the poor. And I think that is still the concern. I mean, we live in a deeply unequal society, in a deeply unequal world, and there's that is inherently unstable. And the U.S. is not able to accept any kind of the ruling classes of the United States are not willing to accept any challenge because they're afraid of that instability.
Jemima Pierre brought up the AOS. This is the OAS, the Organization of American States, and the core group, which is it characterized the core group for us, but also discuss the roles that both those organizations are playing. Because ostensibly, I mean, it feels like it's just a way to make it look like the United States is not being unilateral, and in fact, I mean, just characterize the role they play, I guess.
That's exactly it. The reason why the OAS, the OAS is run by a man named Secretary General Insouza. He was going to lose his re-election battle, but the Trump administration intervened to get him elected as the head because he's a hardliner against Venezuela. And one of the reasons why we're so supportive of Haiti was because Haiti provided a critical vote in the OAS against Venezuela. And this is really back, I mean, it's going back to the 80s where we supported Jean-Claude Duvalier because he was a vote in the OAS against Cuba. And we're still using these regional institutions. And, I agree, you're right, that it is giving the appearance of of multilateralism, but it really is the US, although also you do have France and Canada who have very identical interests who are also joining in.
Well, I mean, expand just a little bit on French and Canadian interests. Are those simply those interests that they have corporate entities that are doing a lot of business there, and they want to protect those interests, and are afraid of like some type of movement to nationalize the resources or these corporations? Is that essentially it?
It's not nationalizing. That's no longer the fear. The fear is that a government might demand a fair return on the extraction of those resources. So Canada specifically is very heavily invested in mining in Haiti. In France, it's less resources. It's more the restitution debt. Professor Pierre talked about that Haiti had to pay a restitution debt to France. In 2003, the Haitian government demanded that back. And I worked on the legal case a little bit, and it's actually a fairly strong legal case. The French response when Haiti threatened to take it to the International Court of Justice was to join the US and remove Haiti's president. That's how seriously they took it.
Can you, I mean, just just to be clear, I mean, just reiterate, because that restitution, I was not aware of that. And it just seems nuts to me. But what that restitution that Haiti was paying France was ostensibly for what?
It was for the lost, the quote, property that the French slave owners lost when Haiti became independent. And that includes their land and their farm equipment. It also includes the slaves that they lost when Haiti emancipated the slaves. So as Professor Pierre mentioned, I mean, Haiti won the old-fashioned way. They beat Napoleon, but then the French said, well, we're going to keep putting warships off the shores, and we're going to reinvade and reinstitute slavery unless you pay us this huge sum. And they were able to get away with it because nobody else would help Haiti. The US, Britain, all of the other leading countries, which were slave-owning countries, they were not willing to support Haiti against France.
I mean, it's not hard to imagine that if you had that 100, 200 years worth of payment was actually put back into the infrastructure of Haiti in some fashion, you know, what the country would look like today.
And it was that was part of it. It wasn't just extracting money. The whole purpose of the debt was to keep Haiti from being successful, so that nobody could point to a successful country run by freed slaves. And it made Haiti miss out on the whole 19th century industrial revolution. It prevented Haiti from investing in education, social services, basic governance, and kept it weak and exploitable up through now.
Can you expand on the United Nations role in upholding the I guess hegemony of the United States, France, Canada, etc., when it comes to Haiti? Because I feel like a lot of people still see the United Nations as, I guess, more divorced from Western or US influence, I should say, than it actually is.
Great question. I actually got to Haiti in 1995 as a volunteer, a UN volunteer for a human rights mission. And, you know, at the time, there were accusations that we were a tool of the US. And I think that was partially right, but only partially right. That changed in 2004 when President Aristide was literally kidnapped on a US plane and sent to the Central African Republic. And the US troops maintained, you know, entered the country and kind of maintained order and prevented democracy from breaking out. But in 2004, we needed our soldiers because we were losing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so the US got the UN to bring peacekeepers in, basically to free up US soldiers. And even they did it under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which allows for peacekeeping missions if there's a grave threat to international peace. There was no grave threat to international peace. And Brazil, which led the mission, originally said there is no justification under Chapter 7. But the US said, well, look, we'll let you lead this mission if you take it. And you know, if you drop those objections. And so everybody let the objections drop. You had a peacekeeping mission that was there for decades. It brought cholera that that killed over 10,000 people. It spent I think it was close to $9 million. I'm sorry, $900 million. $7 billion. And it really helped create the conditions now where you have this succession of right-wing parties running basically a left-wing country.
Is that the core group? I mean, was that essentially the core group that came in and made up of that so-called peacekeeping mission?
It was the United States under President Bush. They really led it, and the Security Council authorized it. And there's a lot of overlap between the core group and the Security Council. And they authorized it. I mean, yeah, Brazil was brought in because it was brought in to lead the peacekeeping mission, because they wanted the coverage they got from having a South American country rather than a European or U.S. country.
Well, characterize the core group for us, and also expand on like what interest is in Brazil. What is the interest for Brazil? I mean, I understand, like, okay, well, if we get to lead the mission, like, what does that do for Brazil in that instance?
Yeah, it was. I mean, this was President Bush had a very clever play with Brazil. Back at that time, there were talks of expanding the Security Council, the UN, to include more permanent members, and there's a lot of talk that Brazil and India were two of the front runners. And Brazil was given to believe that if it could prove its worthiness, which meant leading a peacekeeping mission in a black country and doing what it was told to do, that would increase its chances of getting one of the permanent seats at the UN Security Council. All that talk has since died down, but I think it was something that the Brazilian military liked. It was prestigious for them. But certainly within Brazil, when you talk to Brazilians, they were appalled that their country was involved in this kind of activity.
All right. So lastly, expand on that core group for us so that we get a sense of what their role is and what their function is.
Yeah, it's basically, and there's been there were the Friends of Haiti. There's a whole series of these things, and it's all the same thing. It's all a coalition led by the United States, with at least France and Canada involved, and any other less white countries they can bring in to give it some credibility. But those countries never have any real meaningful decision-making power. It's basically the U.S. and secondary Canada and France calling the shots.
So if we wanted to, looking forward, are there any type of sort of milestones or markers that would give us a sense, we're early in the Biden administration, but is there any type of like moves that we could, I'm reading in the paper 2 months from now, 6 months from now, 9 months from now, that gives me an indication of, okay, this is the path that clearly the Biden administration is headed on. What would they be? What would those markers be that we should look for?
Well, one thing to look for is what's happening in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which has been really interesting. Even before the Biden administration said that they felt Moise had another year in his term, the leaders of the Foreign Affairs Committee said, no, Moise's term ends on February 7th. They've pushed back since then several times. A week and a half ago, they had a hearing bringing up some Haitian experts, and both the Haitian experts and almost every Democrat on the committee talked about how the U.S. was really supporting the wrong side in Haiti. So what I'm most hopeful about is that we are having leadership in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and other people that aren't on the committee, like Maxine Waters has always been great on Haiti, and that those people are going to force a better change of policy. And if a better policy will be, first of all, there's a referendum that the president is trying to organize in June that will be a huge unconstitutional power grab. The U.S. needs to stop that. Second, it needs to support, at least acknowledge Haitian civil society's consensus that the president's term has ended, and it needs to stop propping him up. Most Haitians will tell you if the U.S. stops propping Moise up, he's going to be forced to either resign or negotiate significant democratic concessions. So that's really the big thing, is stopping propping Moise up. not supporting the referendum power grab. They also can do other things. There's Magnitsky Act sanctions that they can apply to government officials that are involved in corruption and brutality. They can try to, allow a better process happening through the OAS and other regional institutions.
So this is going to be a story about Democrats in the House, maybe some in the Senate, pressuring the Biden administration, and the Biden administration may be getting pressured. Where are the Republicans in all this? And we just have about 45 seconds.
So far, the Republicans, I think, are more in the shadows. I think one of the things that Democrats always worry about is that Republicans are going to hammer them on Haiti. Whenever there's a left-wing government in Haiti, the Republicans hammer. Whenever there's a right-wing government in Haiti, the Republicans don't say anything. But the Democrats are worried that if you have a democratic transition in Haiti and you get the kind of people that the Haitians would elect, then the Republicans will start criticizing Haiti.
Ryan Kincannon, Executive Director of Project Blueprint, Advisor to the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for covering Haiti.